Welcome to the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. This is a regular podcast where we'll look at the history of the First World War and travel together across the battlefields from Ypres to the Somme and beyond. So what's in this week's episode? Hi and welcome back to the Old Front Line. I was hoping to bring you another episode from one of the forgotten battlefields of the Great War this week, the battlefields around Loos, but a slight technical issue in the Old Front Line dugout means that instead we'll be returning to the haunting battlefields of the Somme, in many respects my spiritual home, and we're going to walk the battlefields between Trônes Wood and the village of Guillemont on the Somme. But before we do that, thanks again for all your feedback on Twitter and Facebook. I really appreciate the reviews that some of you have been leaving there, and also your comments on the Apple Podcasts page where you can leave a review and like the podcast. And if you haven't had a chance to do that, I'd really appreciate it if you could. And don't forget, we have the Old Frontline podcast website, which is www.oldfrontline.co.uk. This week, because of the dugout technical difficulties, there may not be an immediate page for this podcast, but it will be up as soon as possible. So putting technology to one side, it's time to once again strap on our boots and head out onto the battlefields of the Great War. Off we go. We start on the road between the villages of Montauban and Guillemont. Montauban was captured on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916, by POWs battalions of the 30th Division, the Manchester POWs and the Liverpool POWs being very heavily involved in that battle. They put some fighting patrols out into the neighbouring Bernafay Wood, but that was not finally taken until a few days later, and then gradually the assaults moved towards Trônes Wood, where we are now. Trônes Wood was a big pear-shaped wood. Martin Middlebrook coined this phrase the horseshoe of woods for this area of the Somme battlefield, and it is dominated by woodlands. Delville Wood up the road, High Wood, Mametz Wood, and here at Trônes Wood too. And there were some trenches in these woods at the beginning of the battle, but mainly they were marshalling areas for the German troops, previously having been behind the German lines. But when the fight reached here on the 14th of July 1916, the men of the 18th Eastern Division, and we're standing in front of their divisional memorial now, fought their way into the wood, and when you read the accounts in the divisional history, beat their way through the undergrowth like beaters on a chute before the war, pushing the Germans back through these positions. They encountered trench positions within the wood, and also a German bunker, of which there are no remains of that today. But they pushed the Germans out to the far end of the wood, and those German forces pulled back to the neighbouring village of Longueval. And then Trônes Wood pretty much became our front line for much of the next 2 months, as attack after attack was launched from here towards the village of Guillemont, and in some cases towards the southern area around Delville Wood, which is very close by. The 18th Eastern Division, whose memorial this is, it's a stone obelisk. Originally it was quite a large wooden Celtic cross, and I'll put a picture up of the original divisional memorial on the web page. But this division, the Eastern Division, what does that mean? Well, it's men from the Eastern Command area of the British Army. The army was grouped into these command areas, which then in themselves grouped together different regiments, and the Eastern Command were mainly home counties regiments. So within this division there was the Norfolk Regiment, the Suffolk Regiment, the East Kent Regiment, the Buffs, the Royal West Kents, the Royal Sussex Regiment, the Queen's Royal West Surreys, the East Surreys, and so on. So you can see the connection between them. They all come largely from those home counties from the southeast area of Britain. Raised in response to Lord Kitchener's call for volunteers in 1914 to join the New Army, or Kitchener's Army as it quickly became known, the 18th Eastern Division assembled around Colchester, did its training, and then moved across to the Western Front in the summer of 1915. It went straight to the Somme when the Somme was a quiet sector, and in fact it would spend longer on the Somme battlefield than almost any other division of the British Army, being there from the summer of 1915 right up until the very beginning of the battle in 1916, and with a short break during the fighting itself remained on the Somme right to the very end of the battle and was there right up until the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line in early 1917. Its early months on the Somme gave it its grounding. It learnt about the day-to-day activities of trench warfare, and then on the 1st of July took part in its first big battle, the attack on the ground between the villages of Mametz and Montauban. And Captain Billy Neville of the 8th Battalion, the East Surrey Regiment, one of the units within the division, achieved immortal fame that day by kicking footballs into action with the men of his company. It was witnessed by some of the press correspondents, and the story very quickly spread right across the British media. But after the 1st of July, the division held the ground around Mametz and Montauban and then took part in the attack here on Trônes Wood on the 14th of July 1916. The division chose to erect its memorial here not just because of that 1916 battle, but by a strange quirk of fate, it found itself back in this same part of the Somme battlefield 2 years later in the summer of 1918. Men from this unit attacked and retook Trônes Wood during that final phase of the fighting on the Somme. And I often wonder when I stand here and think about the units that served in this division, and indeed some of the veterans of this division that I knew, how many of these men fought here twice, and one wonders how many of those who were here the second time did not survive that encounter with Trônes Wood. I often talk about divisions on this podcast because essentially they were the basic component of the British Army's operations on the battlefield, whether that was the Western Front, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia or Salonika, and comprised of 20,000 men with 12 infantry battalions, which were organised into 3 brigades, each of 4 battalions. Later on in the war that was reduced to just 3, so there were 9 infantry battalions. They were also backed up by medical personnel, Veterinary Corps to look after the horses, Royal Field Artillery to provide fire support on the battlefield, Royal Engineers to carry out the engineering tasks that the division required, and a multitude of other units as well. And divisional memorials like this, in many respects, they're a little bit strange because not every division has one. You would think that they would. But as I've mentioned before in a previous podcast, there is often a connection between the construction of a memorial like this and a very strong comradeship within that division and a post-war old comradeship in terms of associations. And the 18th Eastern Division had that. I've got an example of one of their old Comrades Association lapel badges, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later on in the podcast. By 1918, there were over 70 divisions within the British Army, many of them serving here on the Western Front. And many of them did apply to have memorials. Not all of them were granted by the War Office. They had to go through a process of application for this to happen. The majority of them are like this, a monument standing in a field or on the edge of the woods like this, or in a location connected with the division's history. Some I like to think are more practical memorials. The 66th Division, which was a Lancashire territorial division that fought in the Battle of Passchendaele in October 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres, post-war decided that it would put in a huge series of stained glass windows into the rebuilt Passchendaele church, depicting the badges of the regiments and corps that were part of the division's order of battle, and also depicting the coats of arms of the towns in Lancashire that recruited men that went into the units of this division. So it comes across very strongly, its identity comes across. But not just that, it's not just the fact that it was a slightly different type of memorial. They also helped invest money into the construction of the church itself. So it was a practical monument. It helped the people of Passchendaele, where so many of the men of that division had died. It was a way of giving back something to those people beyond the sacrifice of the troops who had died there in 1917. But we'll leave thoughts of divisions and memorials behind us for now, and we'll begin our walk. We'll take that road that runs from Montauban to Guillemont and walk towards Guillemont village itself, which we can see as we continue along this road just ahead of us in the distance. As we come to the edge of Trônes Wood, there's a little track that goes up to our left, and we'll take that track now and we'll walk up a couple of 100 yards and we'll stop and we'll turn right and we'll look towards the village of Guillemont itself. Here the landscape opens up before us. To our left is the dark mass of Delville Wood, with the top of the South African Memorial perhaps just visible. the woods on the edge of the village of Longueval. Ahead of us is the village of Guillemont, and we can see the church spire there. And the big open bit of ground between us and the village, and to the right, as it borders the road, is Guillemont Road Cemetery that we'll walk to later on. This area we can see in front of us now is the killing ground of many, many units here in the summer of 1916. Where we're standing on this track was pretty much the British front line after the capture of Trônes Wood. And over the course of the next 2 months nearly, unit after unit passed through here in attacks on these positions. The 30th Division, which was the unit comprised largely of men of the Liverpool and Manchester powers who'd captured the village of Montauban close by on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, with some loss, but not with significant loss as they'd expected, suffered far more casualties here just a few weeks later in the attack of the 30th of July. The Liverpool POWs alone lost more than 150 men killed in action here. And one of the veterans that I interviewed, Harry Redhead, who was in the 20th King's Liverpool Regiment, remarked that it was incredible how the big push that they'd all planned and prepared for and expected to suffer such incredible losses in, despite the foretold success. But the irony was they lost far more men here in a battle that has almost slipped out of the pages of history. Later on in the Battle of the Somme, the men of the 55th West Lancs Division, another one of these territorial divisions recruited in Lancashire, also served in this bit of ground, the ground you see immediately in front of you, and also across to your right on the other side of the Montauban-Guillemont Road, near to a little tiny copse that was there at that time, Arrowhead Copse. This division was formed of battalions of the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment, the Law North Lancashire Regiment, the King's Liverpool Regiments, including units like the Liverpool Scottish and the Liverpool Irish, and also the South Lancashire Regiment as well. A pre-war territorial formation, some of its units, like the Liverpool Scottish, had been in France since 1914, but the division had only existed since the early part of 1916, so the Battle of the Somme, in many respects, was its baptism of fire. One of those involved in this fighting here at that time was the medical officer of the Liverpool Scottish, Noel Chavasse. He was the son of the Bishop of Liverpool. He'd been a medical student before the war, and he had been the regimental medical officer of the Liverpool Scottish since their arrival on the Western Front. As the regimental medical officer, the RMO, he was in charge of the battalion's stretcher bearers, men from that battalion. So these are not medical personnel, these are infantry soldiers trained up for stretcher bearer duties. Despite a lot of misconception, these men were not conscientious objectors because as stretcher bearers they could at any point be returned to a rifle section and therefore go back into battle, although Chavasse often did have orderlies from the Royal Army Medical Corps attached to his stretcher bearer section. Chavasse had been out since the very beginning. He'd taken part in the fighting at Hooge in June of 1915, where he'd been awarded the Military Cross for bringing in wounded under fire in the attack on Wye Wood and the Bellewaerde Ridge. In the Battle of the Somme, in this ground that we can see before us here, he was out picking up the wounded with his stretcher bearers, tending to men in shell holes or on the battlefields, and going out to search for men very, very close to the German frontline positions. For his bravery here, he was subsequently awarded a Victoria Cross, and the citation for that award mentions him being just tens of yards away from the Germans. And when you look at how wide and open this ground here is in front of the village of Guillemont, you can see just how much Chavasse was putting himself on the line to bring these men in. The citation also records the fact that he recovered a large number of identity discs from the dead. Now, you might not think this is something worthy of mention in the citation for the Victoria Cross, but he was putting his own life on the line to recover those discs. Why were they so important? Now, men like Chavasse had seen how the battlefield claimed the dead. If men were remained unburied, then their bodies would be buried very often by shell fire. They'd be obliterated by the power of the artillery. And this meant that these men would be posted missing. If they couldn't be officially reported as being killed, they would be on lists of missing soldiers. And for the families back home, there was always that hope with a missing soldier that he might be alive. He might be a prisoner of war with the Germans or lost his memory in a German hospital somewhere behind their lines. But in recovering the identity discs, this proved that these men were dead. And as hard as that was, it meant that the families back home would receive a telegram giving them some degree of closure and acceptance that a soldier had been killed in action on the battlefields. So what Chavasse was doing here was not helping his men. They were dead. They were beyond his help, sadly. He was helping the families of those men. As the medical officer, he got to know the soldiers within his battalion very well. Whether in or out of the line, he often dealt with the problems that they had in all sorts of different ways. And he knew they had families back home like him, and he knew the effect that the loss of these men would have on those families. And I think that he felt that if he could avoid those families hanging on in dire hope that a loved one had survived somehow, then that was the way that he could help them get through their grief. And it's exactly the sort of man that Noel Chavasse was. He would continue to be medical officer of the Liverpool Scottish, move to Ypres in 1917 and take part in the opening phase of the Third Battle of Ypres on the 31st of July. Once more going out onto a battlefield, this one a battlefield covered with the usual shell holes now filling up with water as it began to rain on the evening of that first day of the Third Battle of Ypres and pretty much didn't stop raining. He knew that the shell holes would be filling up with water and the wounded might drown in them, so he tirelessly went out, hour after hour, with his stretcher bearers recovering those men who were casualties out on the battlefield, and was wounded several times before a fatal wound took him to the casualty clearing station at Brandhurk, where he died. For that act of bravery, he was subsequently awarded a bar to the Victoria Cross, one of only 3 men in the history of the Victoria Cross to receive this distinction. A remarkable man. There's much you can read about him on the internet, but I'd also recommend Anne Clayton's excellent biography of him, Chavasse VC, published by Pen and Sword Books. We walk back down the track, and where it meets the road here turn left and walk up to the large Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery we can see here. This is Guillemont Road Cemetery. There are more than 2,200 burials here, covering the whole period of the fighting between Trônes Wood and Guillemont. And going up the steps, we walk through the shelter to our left into the original Plot 1 of the cemetery. Now there are 3 graves here that many people come to see, and we too will see them. But before we do, let's consider the wider aspect of this original plot. Now these are not men killed in the fighting for Guillemont itself, with a couple of exceptions. They are largely men killed in the fighting beyond Guillemont towards Ginchy, Ginchy or Le Boeuf later on in the Battle of the Somme. And there's quite a predominance of men from the Royal Army Medical Corps amongst these graves if you look. And the reason for that is that field ambulances of the Royal Army Medical Corps set up advanced dressing stations in this area during that fighting. There are some very famous photographs of a medical unit with its ambulances and flags on shattered trees taken along this road during the Battle of the Somme. So these are medical personnel from the field ambulance killed going forward to the regimental stretcher bearers that were maintained and operated by men like Chavasse out on the battlefield itself. Very often there would be a collection post where the stretcher bearers would hand over the casualties to the men from the field ambulances, and they would then bring them back to the dressing station for further treatment and assessment of their wounds before being evacuated even further back to casualty clearing stations behind the lines. So this is a plot where battlefield medics are buried, and men that they were bringing back for treatment sadly died of their wounds in the dressing station here and were buried in this wartime battlefield cemetery. Standing in the original Plot 1 of the cemetery, we can see that one grave stands out quite literally on its own. It's buried apart from the others in the rows behind. And this is the grave of Lieutenant William Alexander Stanhope Forbes. He'd been an architect before the war and was not in the best of health. In fact, when the war broke out, he tried to enlist on several occasions, only to be rejected on account of his health. Eventually he did get a commission and he became a railway transport officer. It's possible that one of his relatives who owned the London and Brighton Railway had a bit of a helping hand in him being able to achieve that position. But that's not what he really joined up to do, to run railways. It was to get to the battlefield. And he managed to wangle a transfer to an infantry battalion in the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry and join them on the eve of their attack on Guillemont. He was killed in action on the 3rd of September 1916, aged 23, going over the top in his first battle. Now, it's not his family tree or even his history, really, that brings us to this grave. It is the incredible inscription on it. And I first saw this back in the 1980s during one of my early visits to the Somme. And it's an inscription that has struck me ever since. It applies not just to this grave, I think, but to many, if not all, graves across these battlefields of the old front line. And this is that inscription. He saw beyond the filth of battle and thought death a fair price to pay to belong to the company of these fellows. Now, I've searched high and low to try and discover where his father, who had that inscription added to the headstone, which itself replaced the original wooden cross in the 1920s, where he got this from, but I've been unable to. It doesn't appear to be any part of any literature or any great work, so I can only conclude that he wrote that inscription himself and that he found those words to express what sacrifice meant to him, had meant to his son, and in many respects had meant to many men of that generation. I often say that the echoes of what happened on these battlefields did not just end with the deaths of these men. They carried on. The families had to deal with this grief, deal with it for the rest of their lives. And here we see one father's testimony marked in stone in a single grave here on the Somme. William's father, who wrote this inscription, was an artist, a Royal Academy artist, a member of the Newlyn School, and was famous for painting Cornish landscapes. I often like to think of him perhaps standing here one day and looking out across the open landscape of the Somme, picturing in his own mind's eye how he'd turn it into canvas, the world of his son, the world that claimed his son in 1916. Behind Stanhope Forbes, in the next row, is another of that trilogy that many people come here to visit, and it's the grave of Lieutenant Raymond Asquith, the son of the then Prime Minister H. Asquith, another broken man as a consequence of the loss of his son on the Somme battlefields. Winston Churchill said of Asquith that he lacked nothing except length of years, that this was a life cut short. And the inscription on his grave reads, "Small time, but in that small, most greatly lived, this star of England." When you look at Asquith, you wonder what he would have made of the rest of his life. Here was a man who was clearly going places, and the war stopped that brutally with his death in action in the attack beyond Guillemont towards Ginchy and Lebuff on the 15th of September 1916. Asquith came from a privileged background, but in the trenches class did break down. Even though the men in a guards regiment in which he served may not have wanted to talk to him directly, Asquith saw things that in normal civil life he would never have seen. He understood men in a way that he would never have understood in Civvy Street, in the life that he normally led before the war. How would it have changed him? How would it have changed his view of life, of politics? We can only but surmise, because, like so many changed by the war ended them, and they never got to live to see what those changes could have brought to the countries from whence they came. The original wooden cross from Asquith's grave hangs in the church at Mells in Somerset, and the Asquith's home is close by. Buried in the same churchyard is also Siegfried Sassoon, the war poet, and there's a great pub near the church, so it's well worth a visit if you're ever in Somerset. Raymond Asquith was 37 when he died, and further down the same row is Lieutenant Wyndham Tennant, who was related to him by marriage. He was only 20 when he was killed 10 days later in the attack beyond Guillemont, towards Le Boeuf. He was an aspiring poet. One of his poems, Home Thoughts in Levante, often appears in anthologies of Great War poetry. So he's another life unlived, another life ended by the Great War, changed too by the fighting here in the trenches of the Western Front. What would he have gone on to write? What would we now know of his verse? And what would he have made of the post-war world? These are some of the many things, I suppose, that we all think of when we visit these cemeteries of the First World War, because it's not just men like Stanhope Forbes and Asquith and Wyndham Tennant with their great family trees behind them whose legacy ended here. It's every soldier who marched down those dusty roads into Picardy or walked the long straight lanes into Flanders fields. We think of what they might have achieved, who they might have loved, and who they might have affected, living the long lives that they should have had. The cemeteries are full, I suppose, of what-ifs, and they make us pause, as they should do, to think about our own lives. Leaving Guillemont Road Cemetery, we turn left and continue down the road towards the village. We meet a junction of tracks, with one going off at a strange angle to our right, and we'll take that and stop. This is the famous Sunken Lane at Guillemont, one of many sunken lanes on the Somme battlefields. And it's here two fantastic Great War memoirs collide. Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel and Francis Hitchcock's Stand To, a diary of the trenches. Junger was an officer in the 73rd Hanoverians, and he joined up in 1915, had served in some of the quiet sectors, and then took part in the Battle of the Somme in the summer of 1916. He recounts in his book Taking Over this sector of the battlefields, the unburied dead everywhere, the desolation of the battlefield. And he recounts a story in which a British ration party, lost in the landscape with no identifiable features, wandered into their positions and were overrun and killed, and they sat there happily munching on the rations that should have been for the Tommies. Hitchcock, in his memoirs, he'd served in the 2nd Battalion of the Leinster Regiment, first at Ypres and then here on the Somme. He mentions in his diaries the same ration party never arriving at their positions, its fate unknown. So two men who both survived the war, who went on to write some of the classic memoirs of the First World War. Those two books crisscross here in this little sunken lane. Junger's Storm of Steel was one of the very few interwar accounts by a German soldier to be translated into English, and it remains a very powerful book to read nearly a century later. Junger was one of those who loved the war. He was never happier when he was in the trenches with his men. Wounded on several occasions, he was decorated with the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, later in the war. I nearly met Junger in my first year living on the Somme. He was coming to the Historia Museum at Peronne to give a talk about his war experiences, and I had my first editions of his book, Storm of Steel, and his other account, Cops 125, all ready for him to sign. But he was 100 years old, and he got sick at the last minute and never came, so my chance of meeting him was lost. But I suppose I've met him again and again in the pages of his books as I've walked round the battlefields where he fought. And I think that's the incredible power of these older books of the Great War. In the years before we had guidebooks, this is what we did. We picked a memoir, we found one in a junk shop or a second-hand bookshop, and we took it with us to the battlefields and followed that memoir around on the ground. For me, it's the way that I've always associated places and landscape with men and stories. It's what help gives the landscape themselves their power, I think. Junger's book is still in print and thoroughly recommended. There was a new translation of it a few years ago, which gave something to it, I think. Hitchcock's diaries are a bit harder to find, but there was a 1980s, 90s version of it, which occasionally turns up in places like eBay, so well worth looking out for. Returning down the sunken lane and back to the roads, we turn right and walk into the village of Guillemont. Outside the church is another divisional memorial, this one to the 16th Irish Division. They were also part of Kitchener's army, some of the first men in Southern Ireland to step forward and enlist at the beginning of the war. It was a division that was brought together, trained, and then sent to France in late 1915, where it served in the Loos sector. Here, holding the trenches at Hulloch, it came under a tremendous gas attack in April of 1916, and then it moved down to take part in the Somme. It fought briefly around Guillemont, but its main role was in the fighting towards Ginchy and the woods, Bouleau Wood and Loys Wood, Bully and Lousy Woods. And the division split up as it was, suffered horrendous casualties in those operations beyond this village, and it was one of a number of places that the division chose to remember its dead, remember its sacrifice after the war. From the church where the memorial was located, we double back on ourselves slightly and take the next road to our left, which is now Rue Ernst Junger, named after Junger and his service here in 1916. Incredible that a French village has a street named after a German veteran of the First World War. And we follow it down about halfway to just before a farm complex. The man who owned the farm on the left, Monsieur Dazin, was an old friend of mine. He was once the mayor of Guillemont. Very, very kind and generous man. And the field now on your right was part of his land. And in it are the shapes, the entrances to a German dugout built sometime before the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and then later reused by the British when they occupied the ruins of Guillemont. Some years ago I was able to go into this. The steps had long since rotted away, and you needed a ladder to go down there. There were signs of some British graffiti on the walls. It was brick and concrete lined with several chambers, and it wasn't really that deep. I suspect it was probably used for the same purpose that the British used it, which was as a signals headquarters, not as any form of defensive bunker. But being beneath the Western Front in bunkers like that was always a special privilege. It was another way of connecting with the First World War. This bunker isn't, unfortunately, open to the public, and I'm unclear about who actually owns this ground now. But archaeology like this is important. It tells us so much, not just about the design of bunkers, but how men lived, the conditions in which they lived, and they act as poignant reminders of what happened here more than a century ago. Continuing to the end of this road, we turn left, and then follow it to the main road and walk out of the village to the communal cemetery on the outskirts of Guillemont. And here among some trees is a French memorial, a memorial that commemorates poilus, French soldiers from the 265th Regiment of Infantry who died in this area on the 28th of August 1914, early in the war. We tend to forget that the French were on the Somme before us, and there were some furious fights in these famous 1916 villages 2 years before between the French and the Germans. And here and there we find, like this, memorials to that. Beyond in the distance are those woods I mentioned earlier, Bois de Bouleau, Bully Wood, Bois de Loys, Lousy Wood. To the left, Ginchy. Battlefields from the later part of the Somme campaign, and battlefields for us to walk another day. It's that part of the podcast where we look at an object connected to the Great War. And this week it's certainly one of the smallest. It's a little lapel badge, which is an Old Comrades Association badge of the 6th Service Battalion, Northamptonshire Regiment, which itself was part of the 18th Eastern Division, which we mentioned earlier on in the podcast when we began our walk at Trônes Wood. I'll put a picture of it up on the website so you can see what it looks like. It was given to me some years ago by my old friend John Dray. Himself a veteran of Monte Cassino, this was his father's badge. His father had served with the 6th Battalion Northamptonshire Regiment in the attack on Trônes Wood in July 1916, and he'd proudly worn this badge as a veteran of that battle of that unit. Old Comrades associations were very important in the years after the First World War. They were a way to bring the veterans together, to talk each other's language, the language that only they understood. And with no support beyond those comrades networks, this, I'm sure, was how some men coped with the experiences that they'd had in the trenches of the Great War. So it's a little tiny object, easily overlooked. I'm sure these things got thrown out so often in years gone by. And there's a whole host of them to all sorts of different units and regiments. I have one to the South Downs Battalion, to the Royal Sussex, that we mentioned in one of the previous podcasts a few weeks ago, in their attack on the Boar's Head. But they point to the bond of service, the bond forged in that service that these men had during the First World War, something that kept them together both in the trenches and for the survivors when they got home. And unlike so many things connected to the Great War, this is not a memorial to the dead. It's a memorial to those forgotten survivors who came home, who stayed quiet and kept that secret. And when I look at it, I think of the many veterans that I had the privilege to know in the 1980s and 90s. And I was thankful that I unlocked the secrets that they had. And I hope it helped them in those later years, helped them to finally, perhaps in some cases for the first time, to truly confront some of the things that they'd experienced, to put them to bed before they too marched down the long trail. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. I hope you found this week's content of interest. Do take time to subscribe to the podcast. Follow me on Twitter @SommeCorps and tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. Until next week, when our paths cross again on the battlefields of the Great War.